Hello, everyone. Welcome. Alrighty. Well, if it's okay with my moderator, I think I'm going to get started. Awesome. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here in this session. I'm super excited to share what we have for you today. We're going to be talking about trauma-informed care and how does that impact our students' well-being and what we can do as educators, administrators, counselors, people who work with students to help them thrive in the world that we live in. Throughout the presentation, you'll have access to my slide deck. We're also going to be using polls, so if you can use your phones or click on the link for the poll everywhere. Let's see, .com. 5. That should take you to our polls, so you can be interactive and enjoy the presentation. So a little bit about the Hannah Institute. We are a branch of the Hannah Center. The Hannah Center is located out of Sonoma, and we have a couple different parts of our Hannah Center in Sonoma Valley. We have a Hannah Residential, which focuses on transitional housing for foster youth. We have a community hub, which provides mental health resources for the larger community. We also have a non-private school called Hannah Academy that allows districts all over California to refer their students to the Hannah Academy who have various IEPs, so we can support them in the learning process. And we, myself and my colleague here, Raina, are part of the Hannah Institute, and we provide trainings for teachers, for Head Start organizations, for city officials. We work with senior centers, homeless shelters, all sharing about trauma-informed care and how that impacts our larger community as a whole. So as we begin today, I'd like you to start off with this challenge of being curious and really practicing mindfulness. Avoid judging others between right or wrong or our own behaviors in that process. Just be curious about them as to what comes to mind in your space. And I want you to ask your question, kind of set an intention today as to what can you do today to help create a sense of safety for yourself and each other. And as we go through this, some of the content can be heavy as we're speaking about trauma-informed care. So make sure you practice self-care in this space, take breaks if you need to, hydrate if you have your favorite beverage. I have my coffee and my water. All available to me at the fingertips, and make sure, you really recognize your senses and what comes to that space. So as we begin, I'd like to share some of the things we're going to cover. I'm going to have a little introduction about me. We're going to talk about trauma and its impacts on our brain, body, and behavior, principles of trauma-informed care and how you can apply them to your classroom spaces, an emotionally healthy classroom environment, what to include in that space, and then how to manage our stress and build resilience as we support others. So to kick it off, I want to share a little bit about myself. I come in with various years of teaching experience, curriculum design. I began my teaching career student teaching in kindergarten. And then when I got my teaching position, I was working as a middle school language arts teacher. I've been an assistant athletic director. I've been a volleyball coach for many years. I held a doctorate in educational leadership and management. And currently I work training teachers both in the Catholic school sector and the public school sector, training teachers to be anywhere from preschool to high school teachers. So if you need teachers, let me know. I might be able to send teachers to your school if that's something of interest to you. So the next piece is, before we get started, I would love for us to practice a grounding technique. This is an easy one to do with students. It's an easy one to do with your teachers, but it's a great way to kind of calm the nerves at the start of the school year. So one of the things you start off with is focusing on 5 things that you can see in your space. So if you're at a desk or if you're in person, what are 5 things that you see? And then from that, focusing on 4 things that you can touch. Then focusing on 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and the last one is 1 thing that you can taste. This is a very simple activity, and it really helps people and young children center themselves before bringing out an activity or whatever it is that you have in place. So as we move forward, I want you to think about a couple different things. Consider a student you've worked with or a colleague you've worked with. What would you consider to be challenging or risky behavior at work? And as you're thinking about that, I'd like you to consider, what have you noticed about that person that's acted out, or that student that's acted out? What is noticeably different in their behavior? And as you're thinking about these things, you want to brainstorm a list of reasons as to why they may be acting out. And think about, is it their personality, or is it their type of person they are? And then also, is it the situation or the environment? I was observing a 2nd grade classroom a few weeks ago, and there was a little boy who was sitting under the desk multiple times and just looking at me and looking at his teacher. And I was just wondering, why is he sitting constantly underneath the desk and not paying attention and not doing the work that he's asked? Later, after talking to the executive director of the nonprofit program, I learned that there was some child abuse going on at home, and he was very fearful of female teachers. So when we go into certain spaces, we may be, looking at their behaviors and thinking, why? But there's so many layers to things that make us who we are, that add to the element. And we're going to be talking about those things. So when we're talking about trauma-informed care, it really focuses on shifting our lens. Instead of really focusing on what is wrong with that child, there is a whole new thing that comes to the part, and it looks at what happened to this child. Rather than focusing on, you're not listening, get up from under the table, sit in your chair, let's go. You're looking at, how can I support this child or the student so they can be successful to succeed? What is going on in their lives to allow them to succeed or holding them back? So it also impacts us as adults and the people that we work with. When we think about a tough situation between a colleague, sometimes we ask ourselves, what's wrong with this coworker of mine? What's wrong with myself? What's wrong with this volunteer? And instead, we shift our lens and ask ourselves, with the trauma-informed care lens, as to what happened to my coworker or the volunteer or myself? What do they need in order to succeed? We are practicing elements of growth mindset in our space with trauma-informed care. Also, if you have any questions and you'd like to throw them in the chat, I will be on alert for that, and my colleague is there to help me as well. So when we're looking at complex trauma, it looks at all the trauma that we've experienced during our youth that happens during our child caregiving time, okay? So some of those are adverse childhood experiences, such as abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. But this list has also expanded. And some of the other things that pop up are the things that are in our systems. So discrimination, poverty, racism, other violence, intergenerational trauma, separation in a household, adjustment of major life changes, bereavement, adult responsibilities as a child. But at the same time, with this complex trauma, there's an element that we want to be mindful about, is the impact on the brain and the body. So when we have all these things happening throughout the youth with the children that we work with or the students that we work with, there is a spike, there's a very high increase in illness. So the physical and mental well-being of the person, when we have these different complex traumas that happen in a child's youth, it really makes interaction more challenging. Building trust becomes difficult. So if we look at our trauma and how that impacts the brain and our different responses, it looks at how can we survive in this situation. When your students come in and they have different traumas, they're looking at, am I safe? And with that, they experience survival responses. So their behaviors are adapted to survival, which is why some of those kids are acting out, right? So they may fight, they may push back, just like that child that I saw underneath the desk did not want to participate, preferred to be under the table, was safe under there, wanted to flight. We had a few kids that were removing themselves from the situation. They did not want to be around their peers. There's students that might freeze in a certain situation. And we also have something called fawn, which is people pleasing. They'd rather avoid and do whatever it takes to be of the pleaser. And these are automatic responses when we have trauma in our lives. And when these occur, we don't think, we cannot process. So you can imagine the students in your classroom or the students in your schools, when they have these fight, freeze, and fawn responses, it becomes very difficult for them to process the learning material that you provide. So anytime there's trauma, the long-term activation of all these survival responses can become very harmful. Even if the danger is gone, this persistent of the survival response is there still, and it impacts their life and their school. So some of those things that I have seen working with college students who've had trauma in their youth, they really avoid forming those close relationships with their peers. So because they don't want to relive this idea of neglect, for example, if their parents left them or a loved one has left them, this idea of having to build trust again becomes very difficult. At the same time, you want to think maybe these elements or the relationships that they're experiencing has helped them survive. And if so, how? So the other element is true as well, and that's looking at we can create positive childhood experiences. So the conversation now has shifted because there's so much things around adverse experiences, but there's also things on positive childhood experiences. And that's where you come in and that's where you make a difference. So both this positive element and adverse childhood experiences really shape our children that we're working with. Positive experience can be also a huge buffer against further trauma or serious health and well-being issues. And it really makes a difference having that teacher who's also trained in trauma-informed care. So we appreciate you being here today. You can be that huge person that makes a difference in that child's life. So in the next section, we're going to be talking about some of the signs to look for when working with your students and what to see as to symptoms of trauma. So some of those symptoms include from ages birth to 2 years. If they have any kind of trauma throughout their lives, you might see some of the following. So they may anticipate pain, discomfort when experiencing any type of happiness or arousal. They might demonstrate poor verbal skills. It might be hard for the children to soothe themselves. They might have poor appetite or digestive problems or low weight. They might have heightened emotional responses. So I always tell my child care staff or students that I work with is you want to think about, is the child screaming or crying? How do you help them navigate their word choices since the word choices are so limited at that time? They might have enhanced physiological responses and disorganized behavior. So I'm curious, in the chat, think about some of the children that you work with. Have you seen some of these examples? What have you done to calm them down if this is the age group that you've worked with? Or maybe you have some of your own children. So in the chat, we have listen to them calmly. I don't work with this age group, that's fine. And the next element is looking at 3 to 6-year-olds. So preschoolers who've experienced complex trauma may feel helplessness because they can't protect themselves. They don't understand the concept of permanent loss or believing any kind of thing as the consequence is reversible, right? So that, again, that child that was sitting under the desk, if they are truly experiencing trauma at home, they're, when they come to class and they have a female instructor, they might have a hard time with that. And how do they know that whatever is happening at home won't transfer in this space, especially if the teacher's yelling at them to knock it off and pay attention? So as a result, you have young children that are difficult, having a hard time focusing or learning. There might be delays in cognitive development. They might have reenactment of traumatic experiences going on. If they see, again, maybe if that teacher's yelling at them, they might have that relation to their mother or their father yelling at them. Someone shared, I just listen to them and try to figure out how the trigger to help them in the future. So when we're looking at 6 to 12-year-olds, students who've experienced complex trauma, you see a lot of the outpour and the behavior issues coming out with school problems. There might be suicidal thoughts or actions, the imitation of the traumatic event. There might be verbal abuse towards others. They might lack confidence. There's loneliness. I know one of my students, when I taught middle school, they were normally very, very happy and very sociable. And one day when I came to my classroom, one of my students was sitting, it was during recess, they were sitting at the steps near my classroom. And it was totally not like this student, because normally they're very chatty, they're bubbly, they're talking to their peers. Later, I found out that they had witnessed that their dog was run over by a car. And, for an adult, that's a lot to process. Nonetheless, for a child who's between the ages of 6 to 12. And you can imagine how they, obviously elements of loneliness. They don't want to talk to people. They need to really think about how they can proceed in that moment. And then they come to school and they're expected to learn. So when we have students who have traumatic effects on learning, the traumatic stress can interfere with the student's ability to concentrate, to learn. It can cause serious developmental delays in our brain and the body. It changes how students view the world and their own futures. It alters the child's behavior interests, their relationships, the behavior of the student in the classroom, their relationships with fear, with their family, their friends, their teachers, their processing ability changes. I mean, you can only imagine. I know some of my friends have gotten in a car accident. If they have to go to the work the next day, or the same day, it's a little shocking. So when you have all these things, it could really impact the student in the fact that they don't want to go to school. They prefer not to be present, which leads to their absence and educational failure and acting out. And all of this leads to educational trauma for the child. I want you to think about a student or a friend that you've experienced during your school years. What are some of the traumas that they've experienced? How did that impact their school environment or their learning environment? What have you seen among your students? So we have another person that shared, I had a 5-year-old who was really angry. They would clench their fists and we would do deep breathing exercises. They could come and talk to me if they were feeling frustrated. Thank you for sharing. So in the chat, I've put, I want you to think about a traumatic experience a student or a friend experienced. How did it impact their learning environment? And if you'd like to unmute yourself, you could do that as well. Acting up, not paying attention. Absolutely. Family dynamic changes brought more tears when separating from the parent. Child was more withdrawn and exhibited more intense feelings when dealing with others in the classroom, both peer and teachers. The same 5-year-old would think very negative thoughts about themselves, would constantly disrupt, zone out, lash out. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. So I want you to take a moment, pause and reflect, because this is a lot to process. Oh, Nikki shared, I had a student who was in foster care and he slammed his fist on the table saying he didn't want to live anymore because nobody loved him, cared about him. He had an extremely hard time making friends. He struggled with social norms. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. So we're going to take a moment to pause and reflect. I love this. Take 5 breathings. You have your hand out and you take an in breath and an out breath, however that works for you. And as you take a moment to reflect, think about what else do you need right now to support your learning in this space, if there's anything. Grounding activities such as this one is another great one to really center ourselves when working with students and with people. It allows us to stop thinking about everything else and just at that moment refocusing, which is really great. So there is hope in this process. And with you, we can counteract some of the risks associated with trauma. You have a strong role in that space because you can facilitate a space of safety, trust, and allow for resilience for that person. So when we're talking about helping others, how many of you have heard the phrase, put your oxygen mask first before helping others? That's a real thing. We need to support ourselves before helping the youth that we work with, especially when we have children with complex trauma history. They're often more impulsive, explosive, or they have various types of behavior when it comes to emotional expression. And so you want to think about if the student's riled up and you become riled up, how does that impact that situation? And yet the flip side, looking at, do your responses help calm their survival responses? I'm an asthmatic, so I always think of, and if you're helping a child who has asthma and they are having an asthma attack, for example, if you come in and you're stressed out, that's going to quickly escalate the situation. But if the person's having an asthma attack and you are calm and collective in that space, it will really help that student tremendously. Obviously, getting their inhalers and whatever it is that you need to do in that space. So as we move through, I want you to think about what are some stressors that you carry from your home to your classroom? What are the things that make you stressed out? And thinking about the child or the volunteer or the coworker, what is it that they say that really triggers you or saddens you or makes you frustrated? What happens when that happens? So when they share something that irks you or makes you frustrated, how do you know in your body that you're stressed out? I know for me, if I drive to San Francisco and I'm going up some of those really steep hills, my palms and my hands start sweating immensely. And then I want you to think, how might your emotions or biases impact the connection with the child or the volunteer or your coworker? Some of the teachers that I've worked with come from very formal training environments. So if they were to come in that classroom and observe that 2nd grade student that I saw, they would have probably said, get up underneath your desk, let's go, let's get busy. But with this trauma-informed care lens, you have a different approach when working with students. So there are 6 principles in trauma-informed care that we're going to explore today and really look at how do these response strategies center around interaction with students and each other. And so the first one I'd like to know before we dive into it is, how do you know what a safe classroom feels like? What does it feel like to you? If you walk into a colleague's classroom or a student's classroom, what does a safe space feel like? And if this QR code is not working for you, you can put your responses in the chat. What does a safe classroom feel like? And again, if it's not working for you, you could put it in the chat box as well. Peaceful, thank you. I know for me, I've seen classrooms where there's just such a strong sense of community that helps in that space. So when we're looking at safety, oh, thank you, organized, absolutely. When we're looking at elements of safety in the classroom, if the classroom is not safe, trauma can lead to internal distress. There's an element of re-traumatization that can go on. The child might be not able to shift from their defensive reactions to what you want them in your classroom space. That chronic stress can become hardwired into the nervous system, which is imprinted in their body as they move on throughout their life. And depending on what you're trying to teach, they're not going to be able to learn that new skill if they're in that flight or fight response, that survival response. So what can we do? How do we address that? We can really, when we're taking these elements of trauma-informed care and we're addressing safety, we're going to prevent our students or the people that we work with to be unintentionally re-traumatized. And we could do this by creating a welcoming environment, really getting to know our students, learning their names, create structures that have a predictable learning environment. So if you're a teacher in the classroom, you can continue to have an agenda on the board so the students know exactly what to expect. Building positive relationships between your classroom and your community. Absolutely. Engaging students who are also calm and confident. Absolutely. And allowing for smooth transitions. And that goes across the board for not only TKers, but all the way to high school. And even when your teachers get their new teaching schedule, we like to know our own transitions. So I want you to think about, what are some feelings that come to mind if you've ever worked for a boss or someone that's not trustworthy or transparent? What are some of those feelings? Yes. Fear, anxiety, distress. I get knots in my stomach. What are some things that come to mind? Students who actively listen to one another, encourage each other. What are some feelings that come to mind when and if you've worked with a boss that's not trustworthy or transparent? Anxiety, yes. Lack of confidence. Fear. Lack of integrity. Lack of confidence and communication. Helplessness, yes. anger, frustration. And these are all wonderful examples. Thank you so much. So when we're thinking about trustworthy and transparency, when you have trauma and you have this element in that person's life, it can lead to a very negative classroom environment. You're going to have students that are really going to struggle with achievement. Their graduation rates are going to drop. And then opportunities for violence, bullying, and suicide are going to increase in that space. So how do we address it using trauma-informed care? The goal is to build and maintain trust among students and teachers. So we do that in 3 different ways: providing predictability, consistency, providing a sense of control for that person. So I'm curious in the chat if you could share as to what does a trustworthy or transparent classroom space look like? What kind of things would you need from your professor, your teacher, or counselor to create that space of trustworthiness and transparency? Clear directions, yes. Organized spaces, absolutely. I need clear dates and deadlines with what is due. Support, guidance, absolutely, especially if you have new teachers on your staff. What types of onboarding tools do you have to ensure that they're going to be successful? Calming corner, open communication, acknowledgement of feelings, absolutely. So another way we can do that is by building an emotionally healthy classroom environment. And we do this by, when you have clear, explicit expectations, there's no surprises. Everybody knows what they need to do. They are clear on their roles, responsibilities, what their purpose is when they come in. There's consistency. How do you provide elements of check-in? How do they know what the procedures are? If they don't follow the procedures, what's put in place to put them back on track? There is a space for low stakes performance, meaning if they make a mistake, if the student makes a mistake, what do you put in place for them to learn rather than just scold them or punish them? And empower and connect proactively. So catch students doing the right thing, provide positive feedback, praise when appropriate, provide suggestions, and really take time to really celebrate those small wins. I know for me, for those of you who teach, when we work with students and they come to class prepared and you've asked everybody to bring an expo marker or whatever it is, when you see the whole class coming in and they've all got together and they brought that tool that they need for the next day, celebrate that. The other day in my college class, there's always 1 or 2 people that forget something, and the whole class, I had a class of 10, it was a very small group. Starbucks was not far away, but they all brought an expo marker, and I said, let's celebrate. So we walked to Starbucks and I got them each a little Starbucks on me. But these are the little things that they'll remember. So when you have those small wins, really take time to celebrate and do something special if you can. The other element is looking at peer support. So when you have students who've really had trauma that's impacted their relationships, they're going to have feelings of betrayal. Their unhealthy relationships involved. And the big one that I've seen on multiple accounts, no matter what age group I'm teaching, is those students are going to have a hard time trusting people. And so how do we address it? What can we do? When we're working with our students, we want to make sure that the goal there is to help them build trust, help them establish some sort of safety in our classrooms, and really promote empowerment in that space. So some of the things that we could do, again, is really building a strong sense of community in the classroom, which adds to developing healthy relationships. So I want you to think about a time that you were supported by a peer. How did it make you feel? What did you notice? Felt supported and heard, confident? cared for, empowered, made me realize I wasn't alone. Excellent. So principle number 4 looks at collaboration and mutuality. Nikki shared it's okay to be myself. Thank you. So when there's no collaboration or no mutuality where you're working together, trauma can lead to lack of control. And when you have lack of control, it's going to lead to not having that opportunity to say or be responsible in that space. So how do we address this? By really having opportunities to heal relationships, by strengthening those relationships in the classroom, meaningful shared power and decision making, giving students choice and options. One of the things that I do in my classes, I provide an opportunity for peer evaluations so that students can really share their voice if they're doing some sort of group project. And the principle number 5 looks at cultural, historical, and gender issues. So in this space, when you have trauma, you have elements of racial historical trauma, so disadvantages, unequal experiences. They may have activated responses or educational trauma. I've seen some students where they're expelled from one school and then they go to another school, and it's just their lack of resources really influence their learning space. I've had students whose families have housing insecurity, and that impacts the child's ability to make friends because they're constantly moving. And so what can we do to address this? Building resources, really building community, having inclusive language, accommodations for our students, and really flexible activities. So if they can't participate with one, how do we provide support services so they can participate? So I'm curious, what are your aspirations and capabilities that you bring to your spaces? What are things that you know you contribute to the spaces that you work in? I know for me, I really have a passion for mental health. So when I come into classes, I really try and advocate for my students to share as to how can I be of support to them. Knowledge, thank you. I teach art every week. That's fascinating. What do you do? What capabilities do you bring to your spaces? You were hired for a reason. What do you bring to your spaces? Building lasting relationships with students. Excellent. Open-mindedness, teaching social emotional skills, talking about how to deal with emotions, all so important. Your employers are very lucky to have you. I have patience and understanding. So with that space, I want you to think about principle number 6. So it looks at empowerment, voice, and choice. So when there is lack of elements such as these, trauma can lead to lack of agency, loss of control, challenging behaviors, and lack of self-regulation. So what do we do to address these things? We strengthen the experience of choice. We can recognize that every student has their own experience, which makes them unique. There are aspirations and capabilities that they bring to our spaces. We have increased student effort and engagement. And really, depending on where you are, if you're working with students on a regular basis, making sure that their voices and choices are heard and that they feel seen by creating a sense of belonging. And with these elements, there's another really important element to think about, and that's creating this conscious discipline teacher. And being a conscious discipline teacher in the world of education, these are buzzwords that we're all familiar with for the most part. There are three elements that are needed in order to be conscious disciplined. So students need a teacher that bridges safety, that has elements of connection, that has elements of problem solving in their space on a continuous basis. And these three elements are rooted in three things, which is trauma-informed care. It's rooted in connection through empathy. There's elements of encouragement, and there's elements of positive intent. When we have these three things going forth and becoming a teacher in our spaces, we have an opportunity to help students with self-regulation. We have opportunities to help students to set goals for themselves as they set opportunities to learn in their spaces regularly in your classrooms. So as we're doing these things, we want to think about the application piece. What do we do to build connection? So one of the things to do that is to think about how can we connect over correct? We want to emphasize building relationships, really understand that we have other people's experiences versus focusing on constantly correcting bad behaviors and mistakes. Now, there's a right time and right place to really focus on that, but there's also elements to focus on the positive as well. When I was coaching volleyball, one of the things I learned coaching by a very wonderful coach during game time, I noticed myself really pointing out the flaws. Fix this, pull back, take this, change your arm, rotate your shoulder, etc. So when I was focusing on all these negatives when I was coaching, one of the coaches I worked for, he said, try focusing on the positives during game time and see what happens. And you have to know the students and the athletes that you're working with really to build that relationship and understanding. But there was a massive shift when I was focusing on the positive, especially during game time. So I'm curious, what is important about this approach? How do you think connection over correction can influence some of the spaces that you're working in? Where do you see some benefits of building relationships with your students? Please put your answers in the chat. What do you see are the benefits of building relationships with your students, focusing on building connections over corrections? Excellent. The brain is more effective and efficient when it's primed for positivity. Getting the best out of them helps children feel more confident in themselves, makes them feel heard. Absolutely. Pointing out the negatives can just add the child thinking negatively about themselves. Building a positive connection builds trust, makes them feel secure. Excellent. It always impresses me when there's administrators that knows every single student's name in the whole school. It's really incredible. Growth at the school, being heard, pointing out negatives can just add to thinking negatively. Building a positive connection builds trust, makes them feel secure. Excellent. So as we move forth, growth of the school being heard, please share some self-care activities that you participate in. Children are more receptive to learning. Yes. So what are some self-care strategies that you participate in? What do you do? For me, if I'm on my way to a lecture, I typically, if I feel like it, I'll stop by Starbucks and get egg bites. Running, playing badminton, making time for exercise. Yes. I have taken a new love for running on a treadmill. The treadmill finally doesn't hurt my knees, which is very exciting. Walking, yay, my word cloud works. Mindful exercises, reading, breathing, walking, listening and art. Fantastic. I'm a member of a winery nearby, so I try and go to that winery as much as I can, but don't always get to it. Walking, sleep, yoga. Fantastic. Thank you. Building healthy habits, eating. So, as we're thinking about supporting our students, we want to think about how we manage our stress to help build resiliency in the youth that we work with. Resiliency is not something that people are born with, it's something that has to be built, such as a habit or a muscle. It needs to be strengthened and maintained. It's that lens that we put in with trauma informed care. So, the way you can do this is thinking about how you care for your health. How do you build your village, your supportive team? Identify what activates you in certain spaces. Manage your time better. I love making to-do lists. Every time I cross something off my list, it increases my dopamine and I feel good. And find time to recharge with the people that make you feel good. So these are elements to think about as you go forth, building relationships, building connections over correction with the students and the families that you work with. So, in summary, I hope that you took away a lot of things from the session today, but we've covered a few things: understanding trauma, understanding informed care goals and practices, adverse child experiences, and some of these things you can find in the slide deck. I do want to finish with what is one thing you're going to take away from today's workshop? If you could share that in the chat or put it in the word cloud, that would be incredible. Your main takeaway today. What is the big takeaway? That would be fantastic. Ooh, correction, connection, knowledge. And as we wrap up, we do have a feedback opportunity. Thank you for putting what you shared in the chat as well. And while the conference also has a feedback survey, we at the Hannah Institute also have one. So if you could be so kind to drop your survey responses, that would be amazing. And I'll see if I can make a copy. Oops. I'll put the survey here for us as well. That would be fantastic. I'll be online if you have any questions for those of you who want to stick around. And thank you all for being present today and really being that agent of change in the communities that you work in. We appreciate you. You're so welcome. Thank you. Yay, you're so welcome.